Thank you, Lydia. That was beautiful. So, as obviously a lot of you all knew, Leonard Cohen passed away last week, and so and we've done a number of his songs and read a lot of his poetry. A prophet in many ways, a man of Jewish faith, and yet a prophet to a lot of faiths and in our cultural time as well. And this idea of one of our favorite sort of notions that ring the bell that can still ring, there's a crack in everything. Forget your perfect offering. That's how the light gets in. What a beautiful sentiment. What a beautiful idea. So I just quickly want to remind you all this story that I've said before, and it kind of fits with our situation today as well. But so this guy was traveling along the road, and he finds a man on the side, a farmer, and he's heading to a new village in a new town. And he asks this guy, "What's the town like where he's going?" And the farmer says, "Well, tell me about where you came from." And the guy says, "Well, it was terrible. I mean, that's why I'm leaving. It was horrible. These people were mean. They were abusive. They were cruel. It was just a mean-spirited place. And you know, what's the place I'm going to like?" And he says, "Well, the farmer says, I'm sorry to tell you, but it's pretty much like that where you're going. The people are mean. They're cruel. I mean, you find the same thing." And so he went on, but disappointed. Now there was another fellow that came along about a day or two later, and he came along, and I failed to mention, of course, that there was a guy also that was working with this farmer. That's important to remember. But this second guy came along, and he saw this farmer and asked him, said the same thing. I'm leaving this town that I came from, and I'm heading to this new town. I'm going to move up there, find some work, I hope. Well, what's the place like? And the farmer says, "What was the place like where you left?" And the guy says, "Well, they were nice. They were kind. I mean, I thought they were pretty good people as a whole." And the farmer said, "Well, you know what? You're going to find the same people where you're going." And so the guy smiled to the farmer, said thanks, and he headed on. The guy that was working with him, sort of his helper there, said, "How come you told the same thing to these two guys, and yet they had completely different orientations? And so you told the one, it's the same town, but you told the one they're bad, and you told the other they're good? I don't get it." And he says, "That's because it doesn't matter what people are like." He says, "It's what you bring that makes the difference." This story that we see in the text is really a perfect story. I didn't intend for this text. It's the lectionary text. We had a whole series. I decided I'm just going to open up the lectionary that we use in churches all across the country and see what text is there. And then here's this Jeremiah text. So before someone says, "Well, obviously you chose a political text," I just went with the lectionary. And yet it's the same message that we probably need to hear no matter where we find ourselves, in what situation, political environment or not, what generation. It's the same message that seems to be about what the kingdom is all about. This tendency for us to kind of label people is this, to kind of see the people we already expect, we already bring with our expectations. It's not uncommon. It's kind of part of human nature. We tend to label quickly. We tend to sort of try to assess scenarios because it's just our brains can't take sitting down sometimes and trying to figure it all out. So we attach labels pretty quickly. I put on a collar, people are going to start responding me differently. If I tell someone I'm a minister on the plane, suddenly I've got a whole different kind of response. We respond to labels, and sometimes we label before we even respond. We look at somebody and we know that they're a Democrat, and we label them as socialist, evil, or mean-spirited, and ignorant, or we say they're Republican, and we label them as rigid, greedy, exclusivist, and abusive, or they're older people, and we label them as obsolete. My parents' age, they're technically challenged, or we see a younger adult and we say they're self-absorbed, they know it all. They're competitive, or we see a homeless person and we say rejected or lazy. We see a ability challenged person, we say they can't keep up, or they're incompetent, or we make judgment. We see a guy in a cowboy hat and we say he's a redneck. We see another person who's tattooed and we say they're an anarchist. We see a guy driving a Ferrari and we say he's got issues. We see a women preacher in a robe, and we think also, I don't know what we think when a women preacher in the robe. So y'all know my wife's one of the preachers here. So So I'm not trying to offend anybody. This is what we do. I mean, when my favorite study in school was social psych. I loved just observing people and doing social psych studies. We just wear masks. We do this naturally, and we associate people with masks, and we assign meanings to them. And we do that with our family, even in fact with our family. And it's sad, but it's true because we've been with our families for so long over the years that some of these meanings and masks have become entrenched, right? They're neurally implanted in our brains, and so changing how we see one another is such a challenge at times. And it becomes habitual. Even the narratives we associate with them and the narratives we tell ourselves because of them, we say, those things are hard to change. Still, I'm willing to bet that for most of you, as I started calling out just images, liberals, conservatives, men, women, preachers, as I just started calling these things out, homeless, you already started sort of seeing something in your head, maybe just fleeting. Maybe it was almost more of a gut sort of sensation, almost imperceptible, but we already go there without even thinking about it. I could say German. I was out in the hall. Linda had told a story apparently in the worship service about an experience I had going from Prague through the Czech Republic and driving us back into Germany, passing through a yield sign in this little town at night and just moving through as a car was up the way. Plenty of distance away, the lights 200 yards. I pulled through and I drove on 10 miles out of town. There's a light flashing at me, and a guy pulls up next to me and I pull over and roll down the window, and my son's interpreting it, and the guy says, "You should have waited a full 30 seconds before you went through the yield sign." And I said, "Thank you," and he turned around. He went back to his town 10 miles back. And the guy in the hallway that I was one of my friends in Sunday school, he's in one of the Sunday school classes I attend sometimes, and he was in that service, and he came right up to me and he says, "You will do as I say." And Linda says, "Why do they do that to Germans?" Well, because, she's German, our son's living in Berlin, and we do it automatically. We associate things. We immediately label things. It's so natural. We ought to be we ought to think of it as sinful sometimes. We just really ought to castigate ourselves sometimes for what we do and chastise ourselves, hold ourselves back, because we do this so naturally, and yet sometimes we're stepping on toes without even meaning to. And here in the midst of all of this, I'm betting that not even once when I gave you all of these illustrations, maybe some of you did, but I'm betting that most of us did not even once when I mentioned the name or the person or the image say to yourself, "Oh, well, that's a child of God. Oh, well, that's someone who shares the very ground of being with me. Oh, well, that's somebody who's God's gift in humanity as I am." I'm willing to bet not even once that came to mind. And yet that's what Jesus is saying. That's it, all Jesus is saying. That the very first thing out of our hearts and out of our eyes should be, and I don't even want to use the word namaste because it's so cliche, but it should be, the ground of being in me sees the ground of being in you. The Christ in me sees the Christ in you. When you do it to the least of these, you're doing it to me. When I'm doing it to me, I am being invited to share with the least of these. It's just the reality of our connection. It's a big house, this idea of the kingdom of God. But its way is very simple. Well, it's not simple, it's hard, but it's pretty clear. It's compassion. Every one of Jesus' encounters began with that presumption of masks, and everyone who saw him encounter people already had the labels and the masks applied. It was Jesus who didn't see the masks, right? It was Jesus who looked past the masks. He broke Levitical holiness codes by eating with people considered unclean. He broke the Roman laws of public displays and protests. He broke the Pharisaic laws, the holiness code. He was breaking rules and laws right and left because he was thinking about something else. One thing I want to give to you, one little idea I want you to think about, is that what we are called to do, what we are invited to do in this big house, this world, I think, is not to change the way that we think about everything. Okay? It's not to change the way we think about everything. What we're invited to do is to change everything about the way we think. I'll say it one more time so that it sinks in there. We're not invited to change everything about what we think, about how we think about everything. We're not invited to change how we think about everything. That's where we are right now, right? We keep thinking we're asking each other to change what we're thinking about. We're not invited to change everything we think about. We're invited to change everything about the way we think. I'll come back to that. Bishop Mike McKee, one of my favorite, he used to be a minister here years and years and years ago, and I was on the one of the associates in the Minister of Youth here back in the 80s, and he was on staff, and now he's a bishop over in the North Texas region. He wrote this thing this past week. He had in his blog post. This is just the first part of it. Now, it's just interesting what he said. I'll just share it, and then we'll talk about it a second. He said, events in our communities and across our nation since last week's election demonstrate the ugly and evil sin of racism that's still among us. In schools, universities, restaurants, other places, children and adults have been on the receiving end of words and actions by persons who seek to instill fear and dominance over others because of race or religion. And to justify this behavior, some have cried that we are too focused on political correctness. That is simply incorrect. He says we are focused on being faithfully true to the teachings of Christ and to our own callings of ministry, whether we are clergy or laity. How our culture or the norms of our society developed into climates of fear resulting in bullying and intimidation and acts of violence is not easily understood. Yet while the question of how we got to this place can be thought of another day, what cannot be thought of another day or postponed is how we will respond and intervene. To choose to ignore and not to intervene in what is occurring is a sin of omission. Well, that's pretty strong language. You could even say it's political, I suppose. There's a lot of brokenness in our country. There's a lot of fear and a lot of hope and a lot of frustration on both sides. There's a lot of struggle within our United Methodist Church right now, because we're struggling over what to do with the language of the discipline. Got a special commission. It's already being talked about that schism is inevitable. And yet I wrote a wonderful text by a guy named Gil Rindle, who is the president of the Texas Methodist Foundation. And the gist of what he said was that it's not a matter of agreeing. That's where we keep getting it wrong. It's not about changing the way we think about everything. It's about changing everything about the way we think. You can't change your propositions, your beliefs. You can't suddenly say, okay, I'll stop believing that now. There's no way to get past that. You don't look for agreement. What you look for is a common purpose for what we are here in this world to be about. And that seems to be pretty simply compassion. It doesn't seem any way around that. And yet that seems to be hard to get to. Fear seems to be kind of the driving force, I think, and reason why that is so difficult. I'm reading this wonderful book by a guy named Robert Pirsig. How many of you read this book? This is going to really tell something about you if you read this book. How many of you read this book, Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance? Okay, wait, keep your hands up. Don't be embarrassed. Come on, show me who read this book. Okay, all right. So we got a few hippies in here, a few folks. It was written back in the early 80s, and I read it in seminary. And honestly, this book was one of the books. This book was actually, Linda told me yesterday, which I didn't realize, in fact, but she said, Tom, that was the book that actually was the impetus for me going into seminary. Well, I've told you guys in here before that before I ever went into seminary and I was in psychology, Linda had said, because I was going through a faith journey, she said, do not become a minister. I will not be married to a minister. She said those very words. And so after I was 1 year into seminary and we had a book group over and we were discussing Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance, she sat in on it, and she was in these discussions that we would have with about 6 or 7 of us, men and women in seminary. And one night she looked at me and she said, I can't stop. I'm going to enter. And it was this book that sort of opened her mind about some things, and I'll share with you some ideas of why. But one of the things that he says in this book that's really amazing to me, that points, I think, to this idea of how we justify acts of not just disagreement, but even how we justify acts of sort of hatred and sort of vehemence, if not violence. One of the reasons why we do this, he said this. It's interesting. He said, "You are never so radically dedicated to something you have complete confidence in." No one is fanatically shouting that the sun is going to rise tomorrow. They know it's going to rise tomorrow. When people are fanatically dedicated to political or religious faiths or any other kinds of dogmas or goals, it's always because these dogmas or goals are in doubt. They're afraid of something. We're afraid of something. We're never so fanatic about what we accept as obvious. Has it ever occurred to you about that? Why do we get so defensive about other things? Carl Jung, the famous psychologist that was founder of the depth psychology the depth psychology approach to mental health, he said that a lot of what we fear in others, a lot of what makes us angry in others, a lot of what frustrates us in others is really a reflection on a deeper side of ourselves that we have yet to unpack. Think about that for a moment. A lot of the anxieties we experience in others, a lot of the anger, a lot of the frustration, a lot of the fear, a lot of the stress that we experience in others is really, in some way, a reflection on something deeper within ourselves that we have yet to unpack. We're never so fanatical about what seems obvious. That's why seeing the Christ in others, seeing and welcoming the humanity of others, the divine gift of worth in others, is so challenging for most folks, because in the end, it's difficult to accept it for ourselves, I think. I've never met someone so happy and generous to themselves in a loving, kind way who is not that way with others. Usually I'll see something else going on that holds it back. And who knows where that's coming from or where it's rooted, but as Jung would say, and as Pirsig is arguing, and as I think as Christ would say, we have yet to unpack that part. I'm going to invite the band to come up here for a second. I want them to share a song that we thought really fits with this whole idea. Linda shared this story that we both found together in her message. During the Rwandan genocide, which happened in the mid-1990s, was a genocidal mass slaughter of the Tutsi in Rwanda by members of the Hutu majority government in 1994. Estimated 500,000 to 1 million people, mostly Tutsi, but also Rwandans, were killed in over just a period of 100 days, constituting as many as almost 70% of the Tutsi and 20% of the Rwandans. 70% in 100 days. There's a story of a young Tutsi woman who was about to be executed by one of the Rwandan soldiers, and witnesses reported her saying to her executioner just before she was killed, "If you knew me, you could not do this."